Okay, so I'm pleased that with us today are Dr. Michele Rivers Murphy, who is the Associate Director of Heart-Centered Learning at the Center. And she's been working with me since like 2014. And with her is her daughter, Julia Murphy, who is a junior, I believe, at Providence College, and has done a lot of remarkable things for such a young woman. She's been moderator for a couple of panels on her campus, and she just got a new job, but I'm going to leave that to Dr. Murphy and Julia to talk about. So I don't want to steal that thunder. So with that, we're glad you're here. And I think you're going to get an opportunity today to hear about activism. And I'm really excited because over the years, Michele has shared a lot about her activism in the community. And sometimes I think that's more of her full-time job than the other things she does. So, and then Julia has just joined. We have a coalition we've started called the Coalition for the Future of Education. And Julia has joined us, as well as Michele, as members of our coordinating committee. So with that, I'm just really excited you're here today, Julia, and look forward to learning from you. With that, I'm turning it over to Michele, who's actually going to play host. Now, Michele, as your host, I want to remind you too, to make sure you say enough about what you're doing as well. Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Mason. Chris and I, like she said, have worked together for a long time, and it's been my distinct pleasure. So Julia, great to see you and so many familiar faces, from Esther to my sister Aude, to your new boss, Representative Smitty Pignatelli, to Jason and his daughter, Reese, and our parents, Paula and Dick Rivers, as well as educators and social workers around the United States. So this is a distinct pleasure to have the next generation conversation with you as our favorite oldest daughter, as Grampy would say, and our favorite youngest daughter, Abigail, will actually join us towards the end of the conversation. And Julia is a senior at Providence College, and Abigail, our youngest, is a senior at Lenox Memorial High School. So we have two seniors this year. Julia participated, as Chris said, in our listening tour. We really sought to try to understand what matters most to young people and our future leaders. We wanted to learn from people like Julia and so many other youth, and how they're making a difference, and how they're experiencing this time of COVID, and how the youth can give us some hope during it. So we hope that this is a continuum of sorts. We have three key touchstones of conversation: community building at PC during the pandemic, Julia's honors thesis on how targets of environmental racism process their victimization, and the third piece is mindfulness and self-care practices, which Chris and I have been involved in so long with our heart-centered work. And it's about practicing the practice and having a positive impact on family, hope, and certainly good mental health and well-being. So during this conversation, Julia's going to share with us her college and work experiences, as well as her leadership roles. We'll hear about lessons learned from her honors thesis on environmental racism and her future in hope and work in politics as a poli-sci major and a minor in public and community service, public administration. So let's just back up, Julia, before I start asking you questions, and provide some context first. This past year, Julia, around this time, your softball team was playing preseason in Florida. And without any forewarning or notice, a hard stop was issued. From there, a loss of softball spring season ran into the loss of a fall softball season. And so many unconventional firsts, from hybrid and lockdown and remote learning experiences on a college campus, no less, right? You, like so many adults, have really dealt with a world of hurt, losses, and unknown in this past year. Along with individual loss and suffering came much social unrest. In equity, national strife, and divisiveness throughout our country. And it really was a time like no other. I was thinking about this today and I said, how do we describe this time? And I was thinking about the famous Charles Dickens classic opening line in The Tales of Two Cities, right? And it went like this. It was the best of time. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, and it was the winter of despair. This dichotomy really best represents this past year in our history to some degree. So to begin with, Jules, I was thinking, what was the worst time in this past year, and what was the best of times?
That's a good question. I think that it's really easy to look at the past 12 months and think that it was all bad, which a lot of it was. Like my mom said, I lost my junior softball season, something that none of us could have possibly anticipated. I lost out on opportunities such as going to Milwaukee for the Democratic National Convention. And even just the senior year, we did not get the celebrations that you look forward to kind of wrap up your college experience. So I think the culmination of loss, it's really easy to kind of blanket the whole 12 months as they were a wash. And they were in a lot of ways. You know, we don't get to see friends and family in the same capacity that we used to. Holidays looked very different, which I know was really upsetting for me and Abby. It was something that we both kind of grappled with, and like this doesn't feel right. And then, like, you know, you kind of alluded to the social unrest that surfaced, especially in the summer, which I would say is nothing new. These issues, like, you know, police brutality, they've been going on, but because of the standstill that our world was put in, people started paying maybe a little bit more attention to than they had in the past, which I think was one of the hidden good things, or maybe the, you know, not explicitly good things that you would think of, but the fact that we were all kind of forced to stop and pause and really look at the world that we live in, it brought some of those issues the attention that they have been, you know, asking for so long and have rightfully deserved. So along with that, I think for me personally, this year has brought a tremendous amount of personal growth that I'm very grateful for. I'm someone who, my mom knows this, but I've been so dependent on structure. As a Division I athlete, I am so used to going from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. nonstop every day. And that's what I like. It gives me a lot of comfort. I love knowing exactly where I need to be and what to do. And the pandemic really, you know, it just said that that's not your life anymore. And that was hard for me. I tried to fit routine in where it didn't work for a while as a way to kind of forget about or distract myself from all the bad things that I had been experiencing, just as a matter of loss. But as a result of that, you know, the culmination of a few months after the pandemic actually started, all those losses hit me a lot harder than I think they might have if I had kind of acknowledged them from the start. But you know, the easily the best part of the pandemic was just the time that I had to sit with not only my thoughts and really figure out what I want to do as someone who's going to be entering the world really shortly, but also it gave me a lot of bonus time with my family, which I would not have gotten otherwise. I finished my last years of high school at boarding school, so I wasn't really around, you know, during a time when most young kids are. So this really felt like I was able to make up for lost time, and I loved being home to hang out with my little sister and see my grandparents and with my parents as much. So lots of good, you know, lots of bad too. I think it's okay to acknowledge that things were pretty ugly for a while there, but I think the reflection and kind of the lessons learned as we seem like there's some light at the end of the tunnel, will be, I think, where people realize, you know, it wasn't all 100% bad.
I'm thrilled, Julia, that you felt that our time together as a family, an unexpected time, was a bonus in many ways, because as parents, we certainly enjoyed every extra minute and moment that we had with our girls. So this leads us into the first conversational topic about community building at Providence College amid the pandemic. And this past summer, you served on the Providence COVID task force in preparation for your return to school in the fall in 2020. I can imagine it was a time of great uncertainty and unrest, as you explained in many ways, and also probably a nervous excitement about returning. So what was the makeup of this COVID task force and its primary focus, and what kind of community building resulted in this work that you did this summer?
Well, I think I truthfully don't remember the specific makeup, but I know that the task force became large pretty quickly. There was, I would say 7 to 10 subcommittees under the overall board structure. So I served as a student representative on the varsity athletics subcommittee. And every subcommittee, whether it was mission and ministry, or mental health, or marketing and communication, residence life, those are just to name a few of the subcommittees and the areas that we're focused on. But every subgroup had at least 1 to 2 student representatives on it, which I felt was really important because our experience is obviously so unique, and probably unrelatable, honestly, to what the administrators were seeing. I think Providence has done a really good job of being transparent with their students, but for me, that was kind of the first reintroduction into a community, I would say, or into the community that I had been a part of, because I just left it, as we all did in the spring. So coming back and working with my peers over the summer, voicing our concerns and just realizing that, my concerns were shared by others was really nice. They were nervous too. They were like, well, it's college. It's there's going to be some really unsafe aspects, and we don't want to get coronavirus. And sometimes you feel like you're on an island, with those concerns sometimes, especially being a young person and wanting to live your life and have freedom. But knowing that I was surrounded by a group of my peers who were equally committed, and concerned with making sure that Providence was as prepared as possible to provide their students with a safe return, that was great. And it made me really, I would say, excited and re-energized for that when I did come back to campus. I would really dive into the communities that I was already a part of, and even enter into some new ones, because community is something that was stripped from all of us at some point during the past year. So I think it kind of re-inspired me to really, really dive back in and strengthen a lot of the relationships that I already had while creating some new ones.
Well, and that reentry piece is so key for so many different students, whether it's elementary school or college or high school, is being reintroduced back to the socialization and regulation. Hi, Jess. Jess Bassinet, teacher, just joined us, I see. I just wanted to give a shout out. So talking about how you felt, that you were easing back into that sense of community set you up for what was to come. You went from the student COVID task force participation to your leadership position as SAC, which is School Athletic Advisory Council president, as well as chair of diversity for the board of programmers. And you were afforded the opportunity to further cultivate, right, this powerful platform of change during this most unconventional time in history. So if you think about what you were able to begin to start to accomplish as SAC president, as well as working with your SAC team and individual teams, both athletic and student scholar venues, the variety of community building initiatives centered around social issues included some highlights that I'd like to just point out, such as creating campaigns regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, as you started a new role in that position, having a liaison, voter registration, as well as student athlete mental health. And if you could talk about this initiative, which was under the all-encompassing more than an athlete initiative, how it came to be in relation to these three highlighted areas of DEI, mental health awareness, and voter registration, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things with that. More than an athlete, I mean, that's tough because so for those of you who don't know, the student SAC is the Student Athlete Advisory Council, and it really focuses on student athlete development off the field. So providing a lot of leadership opportunities for our student athletes, making sure that they all know what's going on in athletics, and emphasizing community service, mental health, all that stuff, like my mom had mentioned. I definitely don't want to take full credit for it because, we're used to being on teams in athletics and this was no different. But my executive board, early in the summer, kind of after following the social unrest that we had seen, really felt that it was time for us as athletes to make work around DE&I a priority. So we decided to actually appoint a position to our executive board who would serve as our diversity, equity, inclusion liaison. So we were able to bring in a member of the men's soccer team to take on that position. He has done a phenomenal job working with the subcommittee that we established in SAC as well. And they have done really remarkable work, just kind of facilitating conversations, which are most of the time, such an important starting point for any real change to happen. You have to be able to have a conversation with people, whether they agree with you, whether they don't agree with you, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And I think that group has really helped many people reflect on some areas where they might not have been as well versed before, but are really important for them to kind of take the initiative and educate themselves so that they can be better allies to the Black and brown and LGBTQ plus community, whatever group it is. How do we be better allies? How do we listen to people? So that's kind of where that work came in. Mental health has been a priority of the Providence Athletic Department for a while. When I was a freshman, they created an initiative that's really become like the staple of not only athletics, but it's a motto you hear on campus, and that is "You're never alone in Friartown." And so we knew going into this year that mental health was going to be more critical than ever to address and make sure that every single student athlete knew what their resources were, knew how to get help if they need it, and also just to really reinforce the fact that it's okay to be having a really hard time, because this is a really hard time for everyone. And we can't possibly expect people to perform on the field if they are not, making sure that their mind is right off the field, or not addressing the feelings of discouragement or anxiety that they might be feeling. So that was really, an effort on our end to just revamp those resources and make sure that You're Never Alone in Friartown had some concrete action behind the slogan that has become so familiar to us. And I think with that, as athletes, we're very much expected to perform under any circumstances, overcome adversity, not complain. But by kind of breaking down that stigma a little bit and saying, no, you are not going to be your best athlete on the field if we don't prioritize mental health and make it okay and commonplace to talk about. So that's kind of the work that we've been continuing with that, which is really exciting. And I think we've been able to help a lot of people, hopefully along the way. And then the last thing was the Big East Conference, which Providence is a part of. We had worked with them really closely to kind of develop a voting initiative. So there was a really jarring statistic that, as someone who's loved politics and really believes in civic engagement, was shocked by. And I think in the last election cycle, which had historically low voter turnout across the board in 2016, student athletes, over 1 million registered student athletes, did not actually vote. So we saw this number and we wanted to do something about it. So the Big East had a voting competition or registration drive, essentially, for all of its schools to participate in. And with some really hard on the ground work, relational organizing, word of mouth campaigning, we were able to register 100% of our eligible student athletes to vote. So, whether they voted or not, that was kind of out of our hands. We can't mandate that, but we made sure that everyone who could vote in the United States was registered and had that option if they wanted to take it. So I think just kind of the focus on civic engagement, and I think all those initiatives kind of point to us looking outward into our community and saying, hey, like, this is a really tough time right now, but there's still a lot of good work that we can do. And we can do it much better if we work together. So I think that was where all of those initiatives really stem from, and we're able to come to fruition, and we were able to kind of carry those into this semester as well.
So just to recap what you're saying, from taking care of your own mental health as individuals, as well as reaching out and supporting each other in the college campus, as well as providing opportunities for higher civic engagement. I mean, excuse the pun, but that was a great win to actually have 100% register to vote. in this time of unrest. So kudos for that. So to just recap this first section about community building, as a young adult leader, does the notion of community directly tie into the importance of the diversity, equity, and inclusivity? In other words, without these three components, can you have true community?
No, I don't think you can, because you're never going to enter a community where there's not diverse identities present. It's just not impossible. There's always, like, we are individuals. We are each, like, you've heard the metaphor of, snowflakes, like no person is the same. And if we don't recognize that as kind of like the first starting point, I don't think true community building is possible, really, because when you understand, or at least attempt to understand, the implications of diverse experiences, that's when you really get to know the whole person. So obviously, I'm a white female, so I've never been marginalized because of my race. There's certain, aspects of my gender identity that have affected my life, whether it's walking home, I can't walk home alone at night, stuff like that, subjective to, insensitive comments about being an athlete and how, like, women aren't supposed to do that. So there's a spectrum, I think, of implications that our identities have, but we really have to create a shared space of recognizing that and understanding it. And I would say moving beyond tolerance too. We can't just tolerate people that are different from us. There has to be some level of empathy, some level of understanding. The caveat with this is too, we hear the term solidarity thrown around a lot. It's something that I reflect on quite a bit. I don't think solidarity is ever truly possible. I think it's this goal that we should all strive to reach. But for me to, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but for me to have solidarity, or, truly understand and be able to put myself in the shoes of the folks that I had interviewed for my thesis research, I can't do that. But if I understand, some of the external factors that have really comprised their existence and their life experience, we're going to be much better, when we sit down and do have a conversation, than if I'm going in blind and taking an ungendered or racially neutral approach, because there's so many implications that come from our identity. So I don't know if solidarity is attainable. I think it's something we should always strive to get as close as possible to. But I think recognizing DE&I is essential for community building.
Wonderful. So let's go on to conversation 2, and we'll take about 10 minutes for this, and then take the remainder of the time to talk about mindfulness and self-care practices for individuals and families, health and well-being. So your recent honors thesis, again, involves how targets of environmental racism process their victimization. Whoa, tongue twister. So Jules, environmental racism is not something that can be simply understood, but rather, as we were talking earlier, it's complex, loaded, multi-layered, Semitic social issue. So when we discuss racism, we often think of the explicit or the obvious acts of racism, right? Such as slavery and lynching from a historical perspective, or individuals using slurs like groups like the KKK. And while explicit racism is very real and very painful, less obvious is the more insidious is actually the systemic racism, or what is also referred to as institutional racism or structural racism. Can you help us understand a little bit better what systemic racism is in regards to laws and rules and how they're perpetuated by the culture, before I ask you a couple of questions about your thesis?
Yeah, so definitely a loaded question. Systemic racism, I think, is a term that has really been brought into the mainstream over the past year with, the social unrest that's been happening, the kind of renewed highlighting, like I said, it's always been there, but police brutality, brought up to the forefront. But systemic racism at a basic level refers to institutions, policies, practices that have basically continued to marginalize people of color for generations. So in the context of environmental racism, you have to go back a long time, but it actually starts with discriminatory housing policies. There was segregation, residential segregation enacted by the federal and state governments in the early 1900s that actually racially zoned different neighborhoods throughout the country, and they're still there through practices such as redlining, you know, block busting. These are just kind of buzzwords for certain policies and stuff, but as a result, we have really racially segregated neighborhoods still to this day. And due to the lack of economic opportunities that were afforded to people of color, many times, they're not always synonymous for one another, but predominantly minority communities are oftentimes low income communities as well, because any chance that they've had for economic mobility has been intentionally slashed by the people in power. And so where environmental racism comes into play is when companies or outside firms are looking to locate environmentally hazardous projects, such as toxic waste, pollution, pipelines. They often look at these neighborhoods because they have the perception of being worth less than like a white suburb, for example. And these practices have continued for years and years. And so now we're seeing the manifestation of that through Black and brown communities that are sited near these really hazardous facilities, having dire health effects. And with the pandemic, we saw that Black and brown communities were experiencing high rates of infection and death from coronavirus at massive rates. And it's very intertwined with the health effects that have been accumulating because of the pollution and the toxic waste and the dirty water that they've been exposed to for so long. So to sum it all up, environmental racism is really the intentional, location of environmentally hazardous facilities, plants, you name it, in really close proximity to these Black and brown neighborhoods that have already endured generations of discrimination, but this is kind of the newest wave that's really coming to fruition at really alarming and dangerous levels.
Wow, that's a loaded answer too, because there's so many layers to peel back the onion to really understand this. So we thank you for that. So if you were to talk about the what, why, and how of your thesis, what was the main focus of your inquiry is the first question.
So I decided to conduct a case study of Providence as an example of environmental racism. There's a Fields Point plant. It's about 2 miles from school, right on the water. But since its opening almost 70 plus years ago, it's been a home to a bunch of different manufacturing plants, electricity grids, and right outside of Fields Point, less than a mile away, is what I've come to know as the Washington Park and Upper and Lower South Providence neighborhood, which are both predominantly minority and predominantly low income residencies. And so my project tracks the 2014 proposal by National Grid to build a liquefied natural gas facility at Fields Point. And I kind of look at the harm that proposal would have caused and will cause, because it was eventually approved, which is really disheartening. And I hope you'll feel the same after I talk a little bit more, but it also focuses on the efforts of the residents to fight against it and the obstacles that they face. So in addition to, outside firms, when they're choosing to locate these facilities and these plants, they look at, yes, race is often a motivating factor, low income is a motivating factor, but because of those two things, they also perceive the communities to be incapable of effectively opposing a project. So they know that when they go into these neighborhoods, they're not going to get the opposition they would, because they don't have the resources to effectively organize. But what happened in the Washington Park neighborhood was the opposite. The community was able to come together in remarkable ways and organize, and they overcome what I referred to as these first level barriers. So just the basic racial discrimination that they faced, the time constraints that go into community organizing, because they are fighting multiple fights. Like environmental racism is one of the many things that they have to fight on a daily basis, in addition to, failing schools. They have the highest asthma rates in the state. the ninth highest pediatric asthma rates in the country. They don't have clean water, they have polluted soil. So they're fighting a plethora of battles at the same time. But because a project like this would pose a direct threat to their survival, they had to find, whatever resources and time they could to organize an opposition. But what my project really exposes is what I call the second tier barriers to collective action, such as discriminatory public hearings. These hearings that, should have provided people the opportunity to voice their concerns had high levels of security that made people unafraid or made them afraid to even go in the first place. They would go for 5 hours long at a time. People who work 3 jobs can't afford to wait 5 hours in line just to say, hey, this project could hurt my family and our health. The lack of media coverage, National Grid was really prioritized in media coverage, and it painted a really dangerous one-sided narrative that this project will be great for the economy. It's a step towards a clean energy future, but it completely failed to expose the danger that would have on thousands of people who lived right down the street. So I'm kind of looking at these institutional and systemic barriers that it unpacks the perception of, no, these people are capable of organizing, but when they do, the systems and institutions in place have made it really difficult for them to advocate for their cause. So it is a absolutely multi-layered, issue, but it's been very eye-opening for me personally, and disheartening in a lot of ways, because it kind of breaks down the promise of democracy that we're all supposed to be accustomed to in the United States. But this case shows that not everyone has an equal voice and is not equally represented. So yeah, it's hard to sum it up.
Well, and that's something we remind ourselves every day, is the privilege of having a voice so often in a grassroots situation, fighting something in our neighborhoods, and to disenfranchise that voice is another layer of oppression. And so this is really important work. And as you ready yourself, having just accepted a new position in the Massachusetts State House with the honorable and good friend once upon a time growing up, and always Representative Smitty Pignatelli, how do you see what you've learned in regards to your thesis is translating into some of the policy work that you will be doing for Representative Smitty Pignatelli in the State House?
Well, I think it actually all goes back to community building. And I conducted both qualitative and quantitative data for this project, but the qualitative side of things allowed me to actually talk to residents of the neighborhood who participated in the organization efforts. And everyone is supposed to be part of this greater Providence community, but as they kind of alluded to, it's a very divided reality. And it was very obvious that the greater Providence community did not want the voices of this community to be heard or taken into account whatsoever. And now that the project has been approved, it's been about a year since its approval. One of the subjects that I interviewed said that, she's been asked to sit on these task force and, work with these different councils because now they want her input. But she kind of shared to me, feeling a sellout because these were the same agencies that took her voice away to begin with. And now that they've gotten what they want, it seems as though they're just bringing her to the table as a formality. And I think that's the key. We talk about giving people a seat at the table. And as Senator Elizabeth Warren says, if you're not on the table, or if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that's important, but having a seat is not always enough. They need to have a platform to voice their grievances, to share their opinions, and the system of the table or the structure of it, if you will, needs to allow for them to have an active role and have agency in whatever decision is being made. So I think when we look at policies, whether on the federal, local, state, municipal level, we need to build better community in those early stages of development so that when we are able to take kind of an intersectional approach and understand that health justice is environmental justice and that is racial justice and educational justice, they're all so connected. But when we're only going with, off of our own experiences, which are limited in comparison, we really miss out on that. So bringing those people in who have been historically marginalized from the decision-making process, and giving them an active role, not just a, formative role, or informal role, or whatever. I think that's where we really need to start. And if that doesn't happen, then I don't know how much progress can actually be made.
So really listening to the constituency that you serve, because they are the ones living this life in real time. So Dr. Yvette Jackson did send a question. She's the equity expert and the author of Pedagogy of Confidence, and also co-author of Dr. Mason's and my two Mindful books. And she was asking about environment and race and how it affects learning, and how the impact of environmental racism on scholastic achievement is being studied and addressed. And when we talked about this, Julia, you said if you would just mention quickly about intersectionality and what that means in relation to this, I think the question will be answered, and then we will move on to conversation 3.
Yeah, so I'm not, particularly familiar with any information or research that exists regarding education and the correlation with environmental racism directly. But what I will say, and kind of what I alluded to before, is just that this is not an isolated issue. The folks who are experiencing environmental racism it's not the only issue that's on their minds. They are dealing simultaneously with failing public schools, their kids suffering from asthma at alarmingly high rates, and it's all connected. If a child doesn't have clean water or clean air to breathe, how can we possibly expect them to perform well in school when they are dealing with basic survival at home? And this, the general point of my research is that this community is not an isolated case either. This is a textbook case of multiple communities across the country who have been subject to the same kind of discrimination. So we can only imagine what those children are dealing with. It's probably not just the couple hundred in Providence, it's thousands, millions even across the country. So I think just the intersectional understanding of how intertwined these issues are is so important, because if we only see them as, one issue that is completely removed from everything else, we're going to miss 90% of the picture that is so critical to understanding how we can actually even begin to start rectifying, the systemic causes. So, yeah.
Oh, that was a great explanation. And that leads us into our last conversation on mindfulness and self-care practices. And I'm going to invite our youngest, come on in, Abigail, who's a high school senior, because a lot of the questions that we had gotten before this webinar had to really do with families and the impact that the pandemic has really had. So this is Abigail. Who's going to Northeastern next year and studying in London, God willing, in the fall. So we're very excited for her. So as a family, as Julia had talked about before, we dealt with the pandemic like anybody else. We had our ups and downs, and there was trying moments and there was triumphing moments and things. So what I'd like the girls to really talk to is to talk about what it is to be their age and to practice self-care and mindfulness, so that they stay in this kind of mindset that keeps them not only afloat, but thriving for the most part. So self-care practices as an individual in a family. Julia's far more routine, as she explained earlier, and prepared oriented. And Abigail is more spontaneous oriented, like her mother, flies by the seat of her pants a lot of times. So it was interesting to see the two during this pandemic and how it played out when they were both back home in the context of family. And so Julia, first starting with you, could you share what self-care practices, including the benefits of mindfulness, that help you stay present in the moment and were helpful to you during the pandemic?
Definitely. So I think that, as everyone has probably experienced at one point or another over the past year, it's very easy to spiral. When you're in a global pandemic, you start thinking about this and that, and I lost this and I'm never going to get to do this again. And there goes, my 21st birthday, there goes my senior year of college, like it's all down the drain. So I think it's really easy to get way far ahead of ourselves and not be present, which I think, being present is where we can kind of gain that perspective that allows us to realize, okay, like things aren't ideal, but there's still a lot of good going on. So the practices that I really relied heavily upon, especially in the early stages of quarantine, I would say, were yoga. I'm, an athlete, so moving my body is really important, and there wasn't many options for me at that time. The gym was closed. Softball, I wasn't really ready to face it yet because my relationship with the sport had been so drastically altered when it was really just ripped away from me. So yoga was a great way for me to stay in touch with my body, tune into how I was feeling mentally and physically. I also relied a lot on journaling, and I still try to rely on journaling a lot just to kind of, get all of your thoughts on paper as opposed to trying to work them out in your head or compartmentalizing them. And then meditation is something that I've incorporated really, really a lot throughout the past 4 years of being at college, when it's so easy to get swept away and the busyness and the, constant go of my life here. So even if it's just 5 minutes a day, sitting, taking time to just reground myself. But I was talking actually in one of my classes today, and we were talking about resilience and how resilience is really difficult to achieve if you don't have the motivation, but also like the understanding of how important it is reflective practice is in order to be resilient. You have to know and acknowledge what you're going through in order to, deal with it head on. And I think that's where I could have been a lot better in hindsight, especially at the beginning. Like I said, I tried to suppress a lot of my feelings. This is fine. I'm just going to work harder, keep myself busy, go through it. But the outcome of that was a really difficult couple months, down the road after kind of the initial shock of everything. So those are just some of the things that I did. I kind of prefer practicing by myself, but we did do some things as a family, whether it was just like a mindful sit, but we were together a lot. So I think I was like individual practice is good for me too, just to make sure that my relationship with myself is still intact.
And it is true that we all stepped up our mindfulness practice. I felt like I went to bed and waking up doing more mindful meditations than ever, just to stay grounded and to watch the girls and really pay attention to what I thought that they were feeling and to have that connection. And it did afford us the opportunity to really connect deeper and really pay attention. And to Julia's point, when you're experiencing bad stuff, mindfulness isn't about pushing things down. It is about feeling it and acknowledging it and then releasing it like a cloud floating in the sky. So you're going to hear from Abigail what she did, because she was home and she commutes to school, high school, but she also had to develop her own self-care practices.
Yeah, I mean, for me, as a junior last year, it was really hard to not be able to see like my friends and have social interaction, because I'm a social butterfly. I'm a very social person. I will talk to anyone that comes along the way. And it was just really hard for me to not be able to see people every day and not be able to like talk to my friends face to face. So with that aspect of things, my friends and I started meeting up at like either a parking lot or like my driveway and like separate in our cars and just like talk for hours. So that was kind of like my medicine, just being able to talk to people at like in a safe way. So that was just like one of the things that we were able to adapt to. And it's one of those things that you wouldn't expect would be entertaining, but it'll be something that we'll remember from the pandemic. And also, another big thing was going out for walks with my dad and my sister. We would walk around our lake that's right outside of our house, the lake. And it was like this 5-mile like circular route right around through like the neighboring town back to our house. And we would try to do it on any nice day. And it was just very therapeutic to be out like in the sunshine, get some fresh air, because that's really all you could do. You were either inside or just doing something outside. So you couldn't really travel anywhere. So we just had to do everything by foot. But that was another thing that I really enjoyed. And now I'm looking forward to it getting warmer now, so my dad and I can start going on those long walks again. But Yeah, it was just very hard to not have like that social interaction, especially I'm also a dancer, so it was really hard for me to have my dance year cut short and not be able to see all my dance friends. But luckily, when things started getting better, we were able to practice outside and dance together outside, and we ended up having a recital outdoors. So like we made the most of it, and I think the things that we had to adapt to, we'll end up remembering for much longer. Um, and also like another thing that kind of kept me going is just realizing that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and I knew that like better days were coming. And I think something that did help was transitioning into my senior year like online. Something I had to look forward to was college and applying to college and looking forward to getting into different schools. And like I knew once I would start hearing back from schools that like, okay, I'm stepping into a new chapter of my life. Hopefully things will get better by then. And it kind of gave me something else to focus on rather than the present, even though it's better to be in the present. It just made me more excited for the future.
So it is interesting how this went in so many ways. And I just want to talk about those car conversations, because I remember my 90-year-old neighbor calling me up after they first started this routine. They would spread the cars out, back them in backwards, pop the trunks, and they'd all have their blankets and pillows because it was still quite cold out in the spring. And you would just hear the laughter of young adults for hours in the driveway. It brought back the importance of human connection in conversation minus the technology. And as families are thinking about opportunities as they are re-entering back into a new normal, we can start thinking about some of the things that the girls have talked about. Taking care of yourself first. We're only as good to others as we are when we're at our best. And when we're at our best, we can be the best parent, the best sibling, the best teacher, the best student. But when we're not at our best, we suffer as well as those around us. So self-care it should be as natural as brushing our teeth every day. We have to take care of our bodies and our minds and have the ability to really take time to just be, like Julia said, introspective, reflective, as well as connecting. So I would like to use the rest of this time. We have about 10 minutes. We might just go slightly over, Chris, if that's okay, if people have questions. But I had received a couple of questions from the audience ahead of time, so I'd like to ask the girls if that's okay.
Michele, after those two questions, I have one too that I received. So
okay, great.
Okay.
So from the audience was a similar theme about how work and home became this invisible boundary within our houses, right? Where so many things were happening under the same roof, and how the family unit had the ability to grow, even be challenged, but certainly grow closer to one another. And now we're slightly stepping back into reentry. So the first question that I received was actually from Julia's head softball coach at PC, Jill Korowski, Coach K, affectionately known as we transition from home back into our daily lives. And you've talked about some of the incorporation of self-care practices. How can we become more mindful of the present moment and enjoy it rather than carry the weight of the world and worries of tomorrow?
Well, I think one of the most important things and what I'm kind of grappling with myself is that we're, moving back into a new normal. How do I, maintain the practices that were really beneficial to me during like quarantine and, really just the last year in general. So it's really easy now. It's like, oh, we're back to normal. Like I don't have to do self-care as much, but I would argue even more important because we don't know, frankly, what the long-term effects, especially in mental health, of this pandemic will be. So kind of being proactive and just, making sure that I stay committed to mindfulness, to yoga as much as possible, and as much as it does fit into my schedule. I think that's really key. But I think, like I said before, it's so easy to spiral. It's so easy to worry. And I think, this has definitely made us look outside of ourselves and really be like, wow, there's a lot going on in the world, which can be a good thing, but in small doses too. And realizing that no matter how much we, may want to, or how hard we might try, we can't possibly fix everything ourselves. So I think that's when we really need to lean into our own little communities, whether it be our family, our friends, our clubs and organizations, stuff like that. And just connect with the people who keep us grounded and keep us present. Because it's really easy when you're by yourself, and I think, time alone is important too, but it's really easy to kind of let those worries consume you. But when you're with people, experiencing all the joys of human connection, I think that's when you're really, brought back to be where you are. And Coach always says too, it's one of my favorite sayings, be where your feet are. Even just looking down at your feet and saying, all right, I'm here. This is where I am. There's nothing I can do about tomorrow. Or my dad always says, like, when you hit the pillow at night, like, you can't solve the world's problem when you're with your head on the pillow. So it's just really being cognizant of where you are in that moment, and realizing that there is important work to be done, but it doesn't all fall on you. And then we really have to lean on the people that we love in order to keep us where we need to be.
Great. Now, Chris, did you want to ask your question? Then I have a question for Abigail.
Sure. And maybe it's for both girls. The question really relates to your peers, thinking through all you're doing and thinking through all the stresses that everyone's been going through, all your friends. What is it that first drives you to do more than just the usual, right? And then secondly, how do we help others to become involved?
Well, that's a great question. And I think we'll start with Abigail, because during the middle of the pandemic, just before Christmas, she approached me, and it's about, she was quiet about, I'd check in with her, how are you doing? No, I'm doing well. And she seemed to be doing fine. And we were keeping engaged and having meals together and having fun times, but she wanted to do something more. And so she came up with this concept of bags of love, and I'll let her describe it. And she actually took this idea and it came to fruition. And she received a wonderful note the other day, and it essentially said that the bags of love were wonderful for the homeless, but what they most appreciated was her personal message on each bag that said, you are important, you are loved, you are cared for. So if you could just briefly talk about how you came up with something outside of yourself to try to contribute during this difficult time.
Yeah, I think when it got closer towards like the end of November, December, and into the winter time, like it was really hard to do more things because you can't really go outside when it's cold. And I just knew that I couldn't be stuck in the house all day on my Zoom classes. Like I needed to do something outside of that. And we had volunteered at a local soup kitchen for a couple of years now, but obviously we can't do that now. And I knew that, like, especially in our city of Pittsfield, on my way out to dance class, on the road, I would see a bunch of people asking for money. And I just saw that, and those numbers like increasing of people asking for money out on the side of the road. And like, it made me really sad that in like the city I've lived in my whole life, I've never seen that many homeless people out and about. So I knew that I wanted to contribute somehow, like even if it's just like a small impact, I wanted to do something to leave a mark. So I came up with this idea of putting together some backpacks to distribute to a local homeless shelter, filled with items like socks, hats, gloves, hand warmers, toothbrushes, toothpaste, deodorant, and just see where, like, I reached out to the service net in our city. I reached out to one of the representatives there, and someone that represents a larger emergency shelter in our area. And so I got the first 24 bags out to them, and they really appreciated that because they said that they have some people that come into their office with just a paper bag and nothing else to carry stuff in. So, and I knew especially the winters can get really bad where we live. So I knew that they would need those gloves and those neck warmers and those hats. And then the second round of bags we did went to the Christian Center near in our city of Pittsfield, and they actually created 2 warming shelters for the homeless to go if they needed to warm up. And they said that the bags went very quickly and they were really useful. So that was really good. But yeah, I don't know. I just needed to like focus my energy somewhere else, like to have like a distraction from everything going on. I think that was the best thing for me, was to just stay busy. And before that, I honestly think that being my age, it was kind of a blessing because I was able to distract myself with the college application process. So I had something that was always like motivating me with like school, because obviously it's not fun to stare at a computer screen all day and do school. So, but I knew that like, if I want to be able to get into the colleges I'm applying to, I need to like continue my good work. So that was like really a motivation for me, was just what was at stake with my grades. So yeah, that's.
And here's the thing, when we're hurting, to extend compassion to other people really helps our mental health and well-being. And I think without Abigail knowing that, that's what she was describing. It gave her a higher sense of purpose and self, and it took her problems, it minimized her problems to some degree, and seeing that there was a need. And when you're elevated by a need through compassion, you really elevate your whole mindset outlook in the best of ways. And so when we're talking about families, I know Jess Bassinet, who's a second grade teacher in town, sent a question. She has 3 kids, all different age levels, a teacher herself who was remote, all under the same roof. And especially her high school daughter, like, how do you provide hope, Julia and Abigail, right? Jess was a great coach to Julia, one of her first pitching coaches, and to Abigail on travel. And they have a wonderful family, but this is what so many families were dealing with. Even those that were healthy were now dealing with unhealthy cultures and feelings and experiences, and not know how to deal with it. So how do you provide hope, Julia and Abby, going forward to your peers? Because with hope, we can get through this together and come out better than before. Julia?
Well, I was speaking with my team the other day, after we had a couple of tough losses, and it kind of just came to me in that moment. But, you know, in softball too, it's kind of a game of repeated failures. And I feel like that's kind of what life has felt like for a lot of people. You're just getting knocked down, you're taking losses left and right. But I kind of, my words of advice to them were like, even if we don't feel like it, we are so resilient because of the shared experience that we have all gone through over the past year. The shared experience, one thing, but the individual battles that we've all had to face throughout this period of time. And we might not always acknowledge it, but it is so important to give ourselves credit for how much we have overcome. Even if it doesn't feel like much, I think celebrating the small victories and celebrating like the really small, tiny wins of each day, that's what gives me hope. Like today, the fact that I saw one of my friends who I haven't seen since last year because they were remote in the fall and I ran into them, like it makes me so hopeful. And I even keep like a bullet journal trying to track like at least 3 good things that happen to me each day. And sometimes they're really the most minuscule events, but they have such an impact. So hope feels kind of unattainable in our darkest moments. But if we can really just focus and really like work hard to celebrate the things that we have been able to accomplish, or the lessons that we've learned, or for me, I'm so much more flexible and adaptable than I was last March. And I'm so proud of myself for that. Like, we have to be proud of ourselves for the things that we have overcome and recognize like, hey, that was pretty rough, but we're almost at the end of it. And there's been a lot of growth along the way. So that gives me hope because I'm thinking of a community with, individuals that are so much more resilient that they had ever been, and the incredible possibilities that can really stem from that, and the type of people that we'll be forging relationships with. So.
And so just to conclude, I'm going to give Abigail a quick minute to just say how she can speak to her peers about finding hope in these most trying times. And then I'm going to wrap up this conversation, sadly.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that my sister was saying. Like, I definitely had some moments over the pandemic where I'm not a very emotional person, but I definitely would just like let it out sometimes. And like, I don't even know the last time I've cried, but I definitely cried a couple times over the pandemic. But, and I kind of look back at those moments and I'm like, if I could get over something like that, because it's really hard for me to like let stuff go and like cry it out or whatever, you know? So I was like, if I can get over like a little hump like that, like there's so much more to look forward to. And even what Julia was saying with like seeing someone on campus that she hasn't seen in a while. Last week I had to go into school at like 5:30 to do a science lab because some kids are remote, some kids are hybrid. So we all had to find a way to do it. And I saw some kids in my class that I haven't seen in a year. And I don't even know, it was just such like an adrenaline rush to like see everyone again. And my friend and I, we were talking with some of our other friend for like 20 minutes after in the parking lot, just like to get that social interaction again. And I don't know, I think really just having those little moments, that's like what really gives me hope, is like when you see someone you haven't seen in so long, like it really just like gives you energy and gives you life again. So,
And I will tell you on a small level, as a family, we have been doing 3 gratitudes for years now. We wake up in the morning and we write down as we get up the 3 things, and it's about noticing maybe something nice somebody did yesterday, or the sun rising or the sun setting. It doesn't have to be big. It can be something small. It can be an exchange. It just reminds us of what's most important is here and now. And wherever you are is the best place to be, I have always told our girls, and that means the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because through adversity, we come out stronger and better people. Look at through this pandemic. We have seen such great examples of human being and compassion, unspeakable compassion of outreach to those in need. And so I'm always hopeful. I'm always more optimistic. Before we go though, I have to ask Julia real quick. Your godchild Reese wants to know if it's been really tough not having your family for you in the team, your peers, your teammates at the games.
Well, since Reese is arguably one of my biggest softball fans, she would go to every game in high school. It is very hard because I think at this point, especially for me, like I'm old, it's my last year. I'm playing more for the people who have gotten me to this point than I am necessarily playing for myself. So to not be able to share that with them is definitely tough. But I know that they're always there with me in spirit. I swear I can hear my grandpa yelling at me to throw strikes, even though he's in Florida right now and I'm in Rhode Island. But that is always, you know, in the back of my mind. But I know it is tough, Reese, and I wish you could come watch me too, because I always hear your voice when you cheer for me as well.
So in conclusion, Chris, and thank you so much for giving us the time to have this incredible conversation. I know that your daughter means the world to you, and to hear them just grow up as human beings and good human beings that have so much to share. This is indicative of the future generation, the next generation, the generation that we're passing the torch to. And excuse me, I would think that you would agree that the next generation is in very good hands. So we wish everybody well, and we wish that you reach out to one person one day and make a difference. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Abigail. And thank you, audience, for joining us today. Be well.